Carlo Gambino was born in 1902 in the small Sicilian town of Caccamo, a place where poverty was not an exception, but a permanent condition. Stone houses clung to hillsides, and generations lived under the same roof, bound together by necessity rather than affection. Authority did not come from the state, which was distant and mistrusted, but from local men whose power was never announced, only understood. Violence was rarely visible, yet always implied. Children learned early that asking questions was dangerous, and that survival depended on knowing when not to speak. This environment shaped Gambino's earliest understanding of power. It was not loud, not theatrical, and never explained. It simply existed, and you adapted or disappeared. In Gambino's childhood, the concept of law was abstract. Police were outsiders, appearing briefly and leaving without changing anything. Justice was personal, enforced quietly through reputation and fear. Young Carlo observed how disputes were settled without witnesses, and how men who spoke too freely often vanished from daily life. Respect was not earned through kindness, but through restraint and consistency. Gambino absorbed these lessons without drawing attention to himself. He was not known as a bully or a troublemaker. Instead, he learned the value of being overlooked. In Sicily, invisibility was not weakness. It was armor. This understanding would later become the foundation of his criminal philosophy. In the early 1920s, Sicily offered no future for a young man like Carlo Gambino. Economic stagnation, land shortages, and constant local feuds made survival increasingly fragile. Gambino did not leave with dreams of success or reinvention. He left to disappear. His journey to the United States was illegal, arranged quietly through underground migration routes used by thousands of Southern Italians. There were no documents that mattered, no official farewells. The crossing itself was dangerous and impersonal. Overcrowded ships, fear of inspection, and the constant threat of being sent back. For Gambino, the lesson was immediate. Borders existed only for those who respected them. In the early years of his criminal life in New York, Carlo Gambino did not rush toward power or visibility. Unlike many young men drawn to violence or quick profit, Gambino entered crime cautiously, almost methodically. His first illegal activities were small and deliberately unremarkable, carrying messages, moving goods, acting as a trusted intermediary rather than a direct enforcer. These early crimes were not about money alone. They were tests. In the Italian-American underworld of the 1920s, trust was more valuable than muscle, and loyalty was measured over time, not declared in words. Gambino learned quickly that arrests were often the result of impatience. He watched peers brag, escalate conflicts, and draw attention from police and rival groups. He did the opposite. When involved in bootlegging-related logistics during the early Prohibition period, Gambino avoided direct contact with alcohol shipments whenever possible, preferring roles that left fewer fingerprints and fewer witnesses. If questioned, he knew how to say nothing convincingly. Silence, once a rural survival instinct in Sicily, now became an urban weapon. Crucially, Gambino understood hierarchy. He aligned himself with older, more established figures without challenging them, demonstrating reliability rather than ambition. This is where his concept of loyalty took shape. Loyalty was not emotional attachment, but disciplined consistency. He did what was expected, no more and no less. When others panicked under pressure, Gambino remained calm. When arrests occurred around him, his name rarely surfaced. This reputation, quiet, dependable, forgettable, made him valuable. What separated Gambino from many early criminals was his ability to think long-term. He did not measure success in weeks or months, but in years. Small crimes were stepping stones, not destinations. Each job taught him how networks functioned, how money flowed, and most importantly, how betrayal was usually loud while loyalty was silent. By the end of this phase, Gambino was no longer just a newcomer surviving on the margins. He had become someone others trusted precisely because he never demanded to be trusted. These early lessons, restraint, patience, and selective loyalty, formed the foundation of a criminal career that would later dominate an entire era of organized crime. In the criminal ecosystem of 1920s New York, Power flowed along invisible lines drawn decades earlier in Sicily. For Carlo Gambino, these lines mattered more than any single crime. His true entry point into organized crime was not violence, but belonging. Gambino gravitated toward men who shared not just language, but origin. Sicilians from the same regions, carrying the same unspoken codes. Among them were figures connected to the Castellamare del Golfo tradition, a faction defined by discipline, patience, and deep mistrust of outsiders. This network functioned less like a gang and more like a closed society. Membership was never announced. Recognition came through behavior. How one listened, how one waited, how one reacted under pressure. Gambino rarely spoke in groups, rarely volunteered opinions, and never appeared eager. This restraint marked him as reliable. Older figures saw in him something rare, a young man who did not confuse activity with ambition. He absorbed information quietly, learning who owed favors, who moved goods, and who settled disputes without attracting attention. The Castellamarese tradition valued structure over chaos. Where other factions relied on brute force, these men preferred planning, alliances, and endurance. Gambino's alignment with them was natural. He avoided reckless crimes and instead positioned himself as a connector, someone who could move between people without creating friction. This role taught him the mechanics of trust, how it was built slowly and destroyed instantly. He learned that loyalty was not proven through dramatic gestures, but through years of predictable behavior. Through these connections, Gambino gained access to higher-level conversations long before he held any formal authority. He listened to discussions about territory, profit-sharing, and long-term strategy. Most importantly, he learned how internal conflicts were managed, not through constant violence, but through calculated decisions made far from public view. This education was subtle, but decisive. By the end of this period, Gambino was no longer just surviving within the underworld. He was being shaped by one of its most disciplined traditions. The Castellamarese connection did not make him powerful overnight, but it taught him how power actually worked. The arrival of Prohibition transformed crime in America from a street-level gamble into an industrial system, and Carlo Gambino understood this shift earlier than most. When alcohol was outlawed, demand did not disappear. It multiplied. What changed was scale. Supplying illegal liquor now required transportation networks, storage facilities, trusted distributors, corrupt officials, and above all, discretion. Gambino saw Prohibition not as an opportunity for fast profit, but as a training ground for power. While others chased visible wealth, he focused on infrastructure, the unseen mechanics that kept operations alive. Gambino rarely handled alcohol directly. Instead, he positioned himself around the movement of goods, coordinating drivers, arranging safe storage locations, and ensuring that shipments passed through neighborhoods without interference. This role was deliberately unglamorous, but it placed him at the center of information flow. He learned which routes were safe, which police precincts could be influenced, and which partners could not be trusted under pressure. Prohibition rewarded those who could think like managers rather than criminals, and Gambino fit this role perfectly. Violence during this period was common, but Gambino treated it as a failure of planning. Every shooting attracted attention. Every arrest exposed a weakness. He preferred negotiation, delay, and quiet pressure. When disputes arose, Gambino often acted as a mediator, someone who could resolve problems without escalation. This increased his value across multiple groups, as he became associated with stability rather than chaos. In an era defined by gunfire and headlines, Gambino's name remained largely absent from newspapers, a strategic advantage that compounded over time. Financial discipline also set him apart. Rather than spending conspicuously, Gambino reinvested profits into expanding operations and strengthening alliances. Money was a tool, not a symbol. By the end of Prohibition's early years, Gambino had built something more durable than cash, a reputation for reliability in a volatile market. He was no longer just participating in the criminal economy, he was helping to organize it. Prohibition did not make Gambino famous, it made him indispensable. The Castellamarese War was not a single outbreak of violence, but a prolonged erosion of trust that reshaped the entire structure of Italian-American organized crime. Between 1929 and 1931, rival Sicilian factions in New York engaged in a quiet civil war driven by Old World loyalties and New World ambitions. While many men during this period sought visibility through force, Carlo Gambino adopted a radically different approach. He did not attempt to lead, threaten, or dominate. Instead, he focused on endurance. The war taught him that survival was the highest form of intelligence. As killings escalated, Gambino deliberately reduced his exposure. He avoided gatherings, changed routines, and relied on intermediaries rather than direct contact. This was not cowardice. It was strategic restraint. He understood that wars rarely reward the loudest participants. They reward those who remain standing when the noise fades. Gambino observed how ambitious men aligned themselves too openly, tying their fate to leaders who would soon be dead. He refused to make such commitments prematurely, choosing flexibility over loyalty to any single figure. During this time, Gambino sharpened his ability to read power shifts before they became obvious. He listened more than he spoke, tracking which alliances held and which were beginning to fracture. He noticed how violence often masked insecurity, and how true control was exercised through timing rather than aggression. When others acted emotionally, Gambino acted conservatively. He learned that neutrality, when practiced correctly, could be more powerful than force. Remaining alive was not enough. Remaining relevant was the goal. The war also revealed a crucial flaw in traditional mafia leadership: obsession with titles and dominance. Gambino saw that rigid hierarchies collapsed under pressure, while adaptable networks survived. This lesson stayed with him. By the time the Castellamarese War ended, many prominent figures were dead or exposed. Gambino emerged with his reputation intact and his connections strengthened. He had taken no territory and claimed no victories, yet he had gained something far more valuable: a clear understanding of how organized crime must evolve to survive. The war did not elevate him immediately, but it carved the strategic patience that would define his future reign. In the aftermath of the Castellamarese War, the old mafia world in New York began to die, not all at once, but through a series of calculated decisions made by men who understood that tradition, by itself, could not protect them. This was the moment when loyalty stopped being a sacred rule and became a negotiable instrument. For Carlo Gambino, this period was a masterclass in strategic betrayal. Not betrayal fueled by emotion or greed, but betrayal used as a tool to survive a collapsing order. The smartest criminals of the era were not those who fired the most bullets. They were those who chose the correct side before the outcome was obvious. The Sicilian factions that had dominated earlier decades relied on rigid hierarchies and personal feuds imported from the old country. But younger, more modern-thinking leaders, especially those aligned with Lucky Luciano's emerging vision, began pushing for a system that prioritized profit, coordination, and stability over constant internal wars. Gambino understood what many did not. The future belonged to organizations that could function like businesses, not like tribal armies. That realization demanded flexibility, and flexibility demanded distance from men who were trapped in the past. What made Gambino dangerous in this era was that his betrayal was almost invisible. He did not loudly denounce anyone. He did not posture, threaten, or celebrate power shifts. Instead, he practiced a colder tactic. He simply stopped being useful to the wrong people and quietly became useful to the right ones. He kept conversations short, commitments vague, and relationships carefully balanced. While others made dramatic declarations of loyalty, Gambino acted like an accountant, measuring risk, projecting outcomes, minimizing exposure. If a leader began losing influence, Gambino didn't attack. He withdrew. And in the underworld, withdrawal at the right time could be more lethal than violence. This strategic silence also protected him from revenge. Betrayal usually creates enemies because it humiliates someone publicly. Gambino avoided humiliation. He let rivals destroy each other while he maintained the appearance of neutrality. He mastered the art of being present but not visible, close enough to benefit from the new structure but distant enough to deny responsibility when blood was spilled. In practice, this meant he moved through back rooms, not headlines, through introductions, not speeches, through favors and logistics, not public acts. It was a style of power that left no obvious fingerprints. By the end of this minute of history, Gambino had effectively positioned himself for the coming era, the era of the Commission, the Five Families, and a more corporate model of organized crime. His defining move was not a single betrayal, but a pattern, choosing survival over sentiment, future over tradition, calculation over pride. In a world where many men were willing to die for a name, Gambino learned that the highest form of control was to never be forced into a choice at gunpoint. He chose his side early, quietly, and without drama. Exactly the way he would later run an empire. The end of open warfare did not bring peace by accident. It brought structure. In the early 1930s, a new architecture of power emerged in New York's underworld, designed to prevent chaos rather than glorify dominance. This was the moment when the Five Families system took shape, replacing the outdated idea of a single boss of bosses with a coordinated framework built on negotiation, balance, and profit. For Carlo Gambino, this transformation validated everything he had learned so far. Power worked best when it was organized, indirect, and shared among disciplined leaders. At the center of this shift was Lucky Luciano, whose vision rejected emotional vendettas in favor of a governing body, later known as the Commission. Instead of constant bloodshed, disputes would be resolved through discussion. Territories would be respected. Profits would be prioritized over pride. This was not peace, it was efficiency. Gambino did not design the system, but he instinctively understood it. Where others struggled to adapt, he adjusted immediately, aligning his behavior with the new rules without resistance. The formation of the Five Families formalized what Gambino already practiced informally: compartmentalization. Each family controlled its own operations, yet remained accountable to the larger structure. This reduced impulsive violence and made law enforcement infiltration more difficult. Gambino's strength in this environment was subtlety. He did not seek public recognition or leadership titles. Instead, he focused on becoming indispensable within the system. Someone whose cooperation made operations smoother and whose absence would be noticed. In an organization designed to suppress ego, Gambino's lack of ego became an advantage. What many underestimated was how much this system rewarded patience. The Commission favored men who could delay gratification, manage relationships, and think in decades rather than months. Gambino thrived under these conditions. He avoided internal politics that produced short-term gains but long-term enemies. He supported decisions that stabilized the structure, even when they limited individual power grabs. This earned him quiet respect, not applause. Within the Five Families, reputation was currency, and Gambino accumulated it slowly, without drawing attention. This moment marked a turning point. Organized crime in America stopped behaving like a collection of feuding clans and started functioning like a federation of businesses. Gambino, shaped by silence, survival, and strategic restraint, was perfectly suited for this era. He was no longer just navigating the system, he was becoming part of its foundation. The birth of the Five Families did not make Gambino a king, but it placed him exactly where kings are made, at the center of order, unseen, unchallenged, and indispensable. By the mid-1930s, organized crime in New York had entered a new phase, one where survival depended less on firepower and more on optics. The men who rose fastest were often the first to fall, exposed by their own need for recognition. Carlo Gambino understood a counterintuitive truth. The safest position in a criminal empire was not at the front, but just behind the curtain. While others cultivated fear through reputation, Gambino cultivated absence. He made himself difficult to notice, difficult to define, and therefore difficult to target. Gambino deliberately avoided behaviors that attracted attention. He dressed conservatively, lived modestly, and maintained a routine that appeared unremarkable even to neighbors. There were no flashy cars, no public displays of wealth, no dramatic confrontations. This was not humility, it was camouflage. In a city crowded with ambitious criminals eager to be seen, invisibility became a competitive advantage. Law enforcement focused on the loudest figures, the ones whose names appeared in informant whispers and newspaper headlines. Gambino's name rarely surfaced, and when it did, it carried no sharp edges, no violence, no scandal, no urgency. This invisibility extended to how he exercised influence. Gambino rarely issued direct orders. Instead, he shaped outcomes through suggestion, delay, and selective silence. By choosing when not to intervene, he allowed others to expose themselves. When he did speak, it was often privately, indirectly, and without witnesses. People followed his guidance not because they feared him, but because his advice consistently led to stability and profit. Over time, this created a subtle dependency. Decisions felt safer when Gambino was consulted, even if he never claimed authority. Crucially, Gambino understood how institutions see threats. Police departments and federal agencies looked for patterns, violence spikes, visible hierarchies, identifiable leaders. Gambino designed his presence to disrupt those patterns. He operated through layers, intermediaries, and compartmentalized relationships. If one link failed, it revealed little about the whole. This approach insulated him from investigations and allowed him to remain operational while others were arrested or eliminated. Invisibility was not passive, it was engineered. By mastering this art, Gambino transformed the idea of power itself. Power no longer meant control through fear, but control through predictability. People trusted Gambino because he did not surprise them. He did not overreach. He did not escalate unnecessarily. In a world built on paranoia, this consistency was rare and invaluable. Minute by minute, decision by decision, Gambino proved that the most dangerous man in the room is often the one no one is watching. His invisibility was not a lack of presence. It was the presence of discipline. As the structure of organized crime stabilized in the late 1930s, a fundamental shift occurred. Violence stopped being a primary tool and became a liability. The men who survived longest were not the most feared, but the most profitable. Carlo Gambino embraced this reality completely. For him, violence was never a strategy. It was evidence that something had gone wrong. Every killing brought police pressure, internal instability, and unpredictable consequences. Business, by contrast, created control, leverage, and longevity. Gambino's philosophy was simple and ruthless. Blood attracted attention. Money created silence. Gambino redirected focus toward industries that generated steady income without constant confrontation. Labor unions, transportation routes, garment manufacturing, food distribution, and construction became central to this new model. These sectors offered something far more valuable than quick cash: influence. By controlling who worked, who shipped, and who supplied, Gambino and his associates could extract profit without visible crime scenes. Decisions were made in offices and warehouses rather than alleyways. Threats were implied through contracts and access, not guns. This was organized crime evolving into organized management. What distinguished Gambino from others pursuing similar paths was restraint. He avoided monopolies that attracted scrutiny and preferred shared control arrangements that reduced friction. If multiple families benefited, disputes decreased. Gambino understood that cooperation was cheaper than conflict. He invested time in building relationships with union leaders, business owners, and intermediaries who had no criminal records but controlled critical choke points. These people did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as partners. That illusion of legitimacy was powerful protection. Internally, this approach reshaped loyalty. Soldiers were no longer rewarded for aggression, but for reliability. The most valuable men were those who kept operations quiet, paperwork clean, and cash flowing without disruption. Gambino discouraged impulsive acts and punished behavior that risked exposure. Discipline replaced bravado. Meetings became shorter, decisions slower, and planning more meticulous. Crime, under Gambino's influence, became procedural. This business-first mindset also insulated the organization from law enforcement. Prosecutors struggled to explain complex financial arrangements to juries, especially when no bodies were involved. Investigations stalled without witnesses willing to testify against what appeared to be legitimate enterprises. Gambino's operations blended into the economic fabric of the city, making them harder to isolate and dismantle. By choosing profit over pride and structure over spectacle, Gambino helped redefine what criminal power looked like in America. It no longer announced itself. It operated quietly, efficiently, and relentlessly. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the balance that kept organized crime stable in New York was threatened by one man's temperament. Albert Anastasia represented everything Carlo Gambino believed endangered long-term survival: unpredictability, public violence, and an appetite for fear over profit. Anastasia's reputation as a ruthless enforcer had once been useful, but in a system now designed around order and discretion, it became a liability. Gambino did not see Anastasia as an enemy in the emotional sense. He saw him as a structural problem. Anastasia's leadership style relied heavily on intimidation. He tolerated chaos if it reinforced his image and often sanctioned violence that served no financial purpose. Murders were not always strategic. Sometimes they were impulsive, designed to assert dominance rather than resolve disputes. This approach destabilized relationships with other families and drew unwanted attention from law enforcement. Gambino, observing carefully, understood that such behavior threatened the entire framework built after the Castellamarese War. One reckless leader could collapse years of careful insulation. What made the situation dangerous was Anastasia's power base. He controlled loyal killers and had cultivated fear as a governing tool. Direct confrontation would have meant open war, something Gambino refused to trigger. Instead, he applied pressure indirectly. He waited. He listened. He allowed Anastasia's own behavior to erode trust among allies. Gambino spoke privately with those who valued stability, reinforcing a simple message: chaos costs money, and money is the only thing that sustains power. Gambino also recognized timing as critical. Removing a volatile leader too early creates martyrs. Removing him too late invites collapse. He watched for signs that Anastasia's violence was no longer tolerated internally. As dissent quietly grew, Gambino positioned himself as the alternative: calm, reliable, and business-focused. He never presented himself as a savior or challenger. He allowed others to reach that conclusion on their own. This was influence without declaration. The Anastasia problem was not solved with emotion or haste. It was solved with patience, consensus, and silence. Gambino's genius lay in understanding that true power does not eliminate threats immediately. It isolates them until they fall under their own weight. By the end of this period, the path forward was clear, though nothing had yet happened publicly. The pieces were in place. Gambino had not fired a shot, issued a threat, or claimed authority. Yet the future was already tilting in his direction. This moment demonstrated his defining principle: the most effective violence is the kind you never have to personally commit. On a quiet morning in October 1957, the era of uncontrolled brutality in New York's underworld came to an abrupt end. The assassination of Albert Anastasia inside a Manhattan barbershop was not an act of rage or impulse. It was the final move in a long, carefully orchestrated transition of power. For Carlo Gambino, this moment represented the triumph of strategy over strength, planning over intimidation, and silence over spectacle. The killing itself was fast and clinical, but what mattered more was what did not happen afterward. There was no war. Anastasia's death shocked the public, but inside organized crime, it felt almost inevitable. By the time the gunman entered the barbershop, Anastasia had already been isolated. His allies had grown distant, his reputation had become a burden, and his violence had cost too much money and stability. Gambino understood that removing such a figure required absolute precision. A public shootout or prolonged conflict would have shattered the balance among families. Instead, the assassination was designed to be decisive and final, a message without a speech. What followed revealed Gambino's true mastery. There were no retaliatory killings, no visible power struggles, no chaotic realignment. Control transferred smoothly because the groundwork had been laid long before the bullets were fired. Gambino did not rush to announce authority or celebrate victory. He allowed the system to adjust naturally, letting others recognize that stability had returned. This restraint prevented backlash and discouraged dissent. The absence of chaos was the real signal of success. The location of the killing mattered as much as the act itself. A barbershop, a public yet intimate space, symbolized the end of fear-based rule. Anastasia was not removed in a dramatic ambush or public street battle, but in a mundane setting, stripped of his aura. It reinforced Gambino's philosophy. Power does not need spectacle. In fact, spectacle weakens power by inviting scrutiny. The assassination closed a chapter without opening another conflict. In the aftermath, Gambino emerged not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizer. His approach reassured other families that the existing structure would be respected. Profits resumed without interruption. Law enforcement faced confusion rather than clarity. The system absorbed the shock and moved forward. This was not merely the removal of a rival, it was the confirmation of a new governing style. With one quiet act, Gambino demonstrated that true dominance is measured not by fear inspired, but by how little resistance remains once the dust settles. After the barbershop assassination, power in New York's underworld did not shift through proclamation. It settled. There was no coronation, no announcement, no demand for obedience. Yet within a remarkably short time, it became clear that Carlo Gambino had reached a position no one else occupied. He was not officially titled the boss of bosses, a role deliberately abandoned years earlier. But functionally, he had become something more effective. The central point of gravity. Decisions across families increasingly bent in his direction, not because he commanded them to, but because alignment with Gambino produced stability. Gambino understood that claiming supreme authority would undermine the very system that protected him. The commission existed to prevent domination by a single figure, and Gambino respected that rule publicly. Privately, however, his influence expanded through consensus building and problem solving. When disputes arose between families, Gambino was often consulted, not as a judge, but as a stabilizer. His recommendations carried weight because they were predictable, fair, and profitable. He never humiliated rivals, never demanded submission, and never positioned himself above the structure. This humility was strategic. It disarmed opposition before it could form. What distinguished Gambino during this phase was his ability to balance competing interests without forcing outcomes. He allowed others to believe they were acting independently, even when their choices aligned with his preferences. This created an illusion of autonomy that kept egos intact while maintaining order. Gambino's power operated through trust density. The more people relied on his judgment, the less he needed to assert it. Over time, this reliance became habitual. Meetings ran smoother when Gambino was present. Agreements held longer when he endorsed them. Silence from Gambino often signaled disapproval more effectively than threats ever could. Equally important was how Gambino managed perception. To law enforcement and the public, he remained a peripheral figure, quiet, elderly, unremarkable. There were no flamboyant appearances, no grand residences, no public interviews. Internally, however, his restraint was read as confidence. Only someone secure in their position could afford to remain invisible. Younger, more aggressive figures mistook this for weakness and were gently sidelined. Gambino did not crush ambition. He redirected it into channels that benefited the system as a whole. By the end of this period, Gambino had achieved a rare equilibrium: maximum influence with minimum exposure. He had no official crown, yet conflicts rarely escalated without his input. He had no public throne, yet the architecture of power leaned toward him. This was leadership adapted to an age of surveillance and scrutiny, leadership without spectacle. Gambino proved that in a world built to prevent kings, the most effective ruler is the one who never needs the title. By the early 1960s, The most valuable territory in New York was no longer measured in streets or neighborhoods, but in movement. Whoever controlled how goods entered, exited, and circulated through the city controlled the bloodstream of its economy. Carlo Gambino recognized this earlier than most and focused his attention on one strategic domain: the waterfront. The docks were not just places where ships unloaded cargo, they were gateways to unions, trucking routes, warehouses, customs, and international supply chains. Control the docks, and you could influence industries far beyond the shoreline. Gambino's approach to the waterfront was characteristically indirect. He did not attempt to dominate every port outright or install obvious enforcers. Instead, he embedded influence through labor unions and hiring halls, quietly determining who worked, who waited, and who never got called at all. This created a system where cooperation was rewarded with steady employment and resistance meant economic suffocation. No threats were necessary. The docks enforced discipline on their own. Workers understood that stability depended on following unspoken rules, and Gambino ensured those rules remained consistent and predictable. This control extended beyond local labor. The docks connected New York to international routes, making them ideal for smuggling and discreet movement of goods. Gambino leveraged these pathways not for reckless trafficking, but for controlled, high-margin operations that minimized risk. Timing was crucial. Cargo delays, missing paperwork, or selective inspections could be arranged without drama. Everything looked procedural. To outsiders, the system appeared bureaucratic. To insiders, it was absolute control disguised as routine. What made Gambino's dock empire especially powerful was its insulation from violence. Conflicts were resolved through access, not force. A business that cooperated received smooth logistics. One that resisted faced endless problems: slow unloading, misplaced shipments, unreliable labor. These pressures were legal adjacent, difficult to prosecute, and devastatingly effective. Law enforcement struggled to isolate wrongdoing because no single act looked criminal in isolation. It was the pattern that mattered, and patterns were hard to prove. The waterfront also reinforced Gambino's broader philosophy. Power should flow through systems, not personalities. If one individual was arrested or replaced, the machinery continued. This redundancy made the empire resilient. While other bosses relied on fear and visibility, Gambino relied on infrastructure and dependency. By the mid-1960s, the docks had become one of his most reliable sources of influence, quietly binding unions, businesses, and international trade into a network that served his interests without ever mentioning his name. The empire did not announce itself. It unloaded cargo on time, every time, and that reliability was the real display of power. By the mid-1960s, American law enforcement believed it was winning the war against organized crime. Raids increased, informants multiplied, and new federal tools promised deeper reach into criminal networks. Yet this confidence rested on a dangerous misunderstanding. Investigators were trained to pursue visibility, violent crime, public figures, dramatic power struggles. Carlo Gambino built his entire empire in the space those methods could not easily reach. He did not defeat law enforcement by confronting it. He defeated it by making himself irrelevant to its expectations. Gambino's greatest protection was not corruption or intimidation, but misclassification. Authorities often saw him as a background figure, a traditionalist from an older generation with limited operational relevance. He rarely appeared in surveillance photographs, avoided recorded phone conversations, and delegated through layers that insulated him from direct contact with criminal acts. When arrests occurred, they hit the edges of the organization, not the center. Gambino designed his role so that even successful prosecutions failed to reveal the structure above them. Another blind spot was the legal ambiguity of his operations. Much of Gambino's influence ran through unions, contracts, employment decisions, and logistics, areas where misconduct appeared administrative rather than criminal. Investigators struggled to explain to juries how power could be exercised without explicit threats or violence. Cases collapsed under complexity, Patterns were suspected but difficult to prove. Gambino understood that the law was reactive by nature. It responded best to clear violations. He built systems that functioned between violations, exploiting gray zones where intent was nearly impossible to demonstrate. Gambino also benefited from institutional fragmentation. Local police, state authorities, and federal agencies often worked in parallel rather than coordination. Information moved slowly, and Gambino moved slower still, deliberately. He avoided sudden shifts in behavior that might trigger suspicion. His routines were boring by design. Surveillance teams watching him often reported nothing of interest: short walks, quiet meetings, ordinary social clubs. This monotony worked in his favor. Resources were redirected toward flashier targets who produced quicker results. Perhaps most importantly, Gambino understood time as a weapon. Investigations came and went, careers ended, priorities shifted. He outlasted them. While aggressive bosses drew attention and burned out under pressure, Gambino remained constant. Decades passed without a major conviction tied directly to him. This longevity created a feedback loop. The longer he avoided prosecution, the less urgent he appeared as a target. Law enforcement chased fires. Gambino built foundations. By the end of this period, Gambino had achieved something extraordinary. Not immunity, but invisibility within the system designed to expose him. The blind spots were not accidental. They were engineered. He shaped his criminal identity around what institutions could not easily see, proving that the most effective way to evade power is not to fight it, but to understand how it looks for enemies, and never resemble one. At the core of Carlo Gambino's longevity was a principle so rigid it bordered on obsession: family above all else. This was not sentimentality. It was governance. Gambino believed that organizations collapse when loyalty is abstract. To prevent that, he anchored trust in bloodlines, marriages, and tightly controlled inner circles. Nepotism, often criticized elsewhere, was for Gambino a security protocol. Family members were predictable, invested, and bound by consequences that extended beyond prison or money. Betrayal was not merely disloyal, it was self-destruction. Gambino structured his inner operations to resemble a household rather than a corporation. Roles were clearly defined, advancement was slow, and expectations were unwavering. Young associates were taught patience before profit. They learned that discretion mattered more than bravado, and that obedience was not weakness, but survival. Orders were rarely shouted. They were implied. Discipline was enforced quietly, often through exclusion rather than punishment. To be frozen out, to stop receiving calls, invitations, or opportunities, was a warning more powerful than threats. It reminded everyone that belonging was conditional. Marriage alliances reinforced this structure. Families were linked not only by business, but by kinship, creating overlapping obligations that made impulsive conflict irrational. Disputes were framed as internal matters to be resolved privately, preserving the appearance of unity. Gambino discouraged emotional decision-making and treated anger as a liability. Personal grievances were subordinate to collective stability. In this environment, loyalty became habitual, reinforced by daily routines and long-term dependency rather than fear. Information control was another pillar. Gambino limited who knew what, ensuring that even trusted family members held only partial knowledge. This compartmentalization reduced risk and increased resilience. If one person failed, the structure endured. Trust was real, but it was never absolute. Gambino trusted people to behave in their own best interests, then designed the system so that their best interests aligned with his. Family ties made this alignment durable. By prioritizing family, Gambino also shaped succession. Leadership was not seized, it was prepared. Potential successors were tested over years, not announced overnight. This reduced shocks and prevented power vacuums. When change eventually came, it felt procedural rather than revolutionary. The organization continued to function because it was built to survive individuals. This philosophy explains why Gambino's era was marked by stability, while others dissolved into chaos. He did not rule through terror or charisma. He ruled through structure, habit, and obligation. Family was not a slogan. It was the framework that turned silence into loyalty and loyalty into longevity. In a world where exposure meant extinction, Gambino built an organization that behaved like a closed circle, protective,
By the late 1960s
disciplined,
and early
hard to
1970s,
penetrate. Carlo Gambino had achieved something no other mafia leader of his era managed: absolute influence without public identity. While other bosses fought for dominance, Gambino refined maintenance. His power no longer depended on expansion, but on equilibrium. He avoided unnecessary change, believing that growth attracted attention, and attention attracted destruction. Stability was profit. Predictability was protection. As American society entered an age of media saturation, Gambino instinctively rejected visibility. He understood that television, wiretaps, and aggressive federal prosecutions had changed the environment permanently. The mafia could no longer behave as it once had. Gambino responded not with defiance, but with reduction. Fewer meetings, fewer words, fewer risks. He slowed everything down. This frustrated younger, more aggressive figures, but it preserved the organization. Gambino ruled like an administrator of decay, extending relevance in a hostile age. His greatest long-term decision was succession. Gambino chose Paul Castellano, a businessman rather than a street enforcer, signaling continuity of the business over blood doctrine. It was a rational choice, not a popular one. Gambino believed the future belonged to men who understood contracts, logistics, and leverage, not charisma. He underestimated, however, how much the culture beneath him had changed. After Gambino's death in 1976, the system he built began to fracture. His absence removed the central stabilizer. Castellano lacked Gambino's instinct for emotional control and symbolic restraint. Tensions grew. Then came John Gotti, the anti-Gambino. Gotti embraced media, spectacle, and defiance. Where Gambino avoided cameras, Gotti welcomed them. Where Gambino used silence, Gotti used sound. The result was short-term fame and long-term collapse. Federal attention intensified. Convictions followed. The era of invisibility ended. Gambino's true legacy is not violence, wealth, or myth. It is method. He demonstrated that criminal power functions best when it imitates bureaucracy. Slow, boring, and resilient. He understood institutions better than institutions understood him. His life proves a paradox, that the most successful criminal leader is the one history almost forgets. No dramatic downfall, no prison sentence, no public reckoning, just disappearance. In the end, Carlo Gambino did not lose power. Power simply outlived him, briefly. And when the silence he enforced was broken, the empire collapsed under the weight of its own noise. His story is not a warning about crime. It is a warning about systems, that those who master how power hides often control more than those who display it. What ultimately separates Carlo Gambino from every other mafia figure is not scale, cruelty, or legend. It is absence. Gambino left behind no recorded speeches, no iconic photographs of power, no dramatic courtroom scenes. His influence existed almost entirely in consequence rather than evidence. Streets ran quietly. Businesses functioned smoothly. Conflicts dissolved before becoming visible. This absence was intentional. Gambino understood that in the modern world, visibility equals vulnerability. Unlike those who came after him, Gambino never mistook fear for control or fame for authority. He believed power should feel boring, procedural, and inevitable. The moment power becomes theatrical, it invites challenge. When it becomes noisy, it attracts enemies. Gambino reduced power to routine, something people depended on without thinking about it. That dependency was his shield. His life also exposes a deeper truth about systems of control. The most dangerous structures are not those built on violence, but those built on normalcy. Gambino did not disrupt society. He embedded himself within it. And when he was gone, the system he designed briefly continued, until ambition, ego, and noise destroyed the silence that held it together. In that sense, Gambino's story is less about crime and more about governance. He proved that authority does not need to be seen to be obeyed, and that once silence is broken, even the strongest empires collapse under the weight of their own voices.